if you will. Let us say, just as an example, someone was able to move through time. And their reasoning for this action was to assist one of their parents. Now the transfer is successful. They're able to go back in time somehow and interact freely with their parents before their parents even met, way before they've had a chance to be conceived, possibly even before the genetic material even existed on Earth that would eventually lead to their creation, to their birth. And it is during these interactions the individual unknowingly, or perhaps knowingly, whatever the situation may be, their actions influence the natural chain of events. It disrupts it. Their parents might have taken in order for them to meet under natural circumstances. The parents eventually get together, but they cannot help but wonder just one thing once they realize what has transpired. And perhaps it's not the healthiest of thoughts to carry on in a personal relationship, but nevertheless they cannot help themselves. Did their child influence free will? Did their child inevitably rob them of free will? And what alternate reality? What is it in the parents' prospective future that made it so such a task was deemed necessary? Ponder me these questions. Would time travel, used as such, to influence the behaviors of your parents, no matter how well-intended you may have been, does that affect the parents' free will? Ponder me this question as I tell you the story of a timeless child.
Daddy, please don't do it. Please don't do it. Don't do it.
My name is Dakota Frandsen. Some of you know me as a specialist of the strange. Others may know me from the Bald and Bonkers Show, as well as the Bald and Bonkers Network, LLC. Before I get into this story, I am obligated to give you this warning. The situation I'm about to describe is not for the faint of heart. The situations I'm about to describe may trigger some people, especially with the timing of this release being so close to the holidays. So, I urge you, if you or someone you know is having issues with a mental health crisis, regardless of the situation, please know that you're not alone. Please reach out. There are resources available out there to help you without judgment. Do not let judgment affect your well-being. If you feel like you can't talk to family, if you feel like you can't talk to friends, there's hotlines out there. And it's an international effort to try to make people stick around, to help people realize that no matter how rough life may get, no matter how insane things go, no matter how much it seems like you can't just pull it together, there are brighter days ahead. A part of me cannot help but wonder if certain groups are misguided in their intentions. They might use phrases like love and light, keeping things high vibration. And while they may have the best of intentions, they also have a pattern of ignoring someone who truly needs help. They may feel that they are protecting others, but in these moments, they inadvertently make people feel lost. Sometimes, in order to build better days, we have to acknowledge the shitstorms and the lessons that come behind them. New age concepts and followers try to say we shouldn't share these types of encounters as they may manifest negative intentions. But I will also say this, in many ways, these same groups utilize that as a justification for their own bias. The individuals who may not be doing a very good job in regards to presenting certain ideas that things can't go wrong. They present these ideas and end up pardon my harsh words, but they ended up bastardizing the whole effort to try to understand what's really going on out there. This idea that if something doesn't resonate with you, there might be something wrong has been bastardized by people seeking to fulfill their own bias. This leaves many people in confusion who are still struggling to try to figure things out, to see the light at the end of the tunnel, in a manner of speaking, to find the silver linings in every storm. This is my belief, and this is why I share this. And trust me, there's been several people who have been concerned that the way my mind processes things tends to get dead centered on doom and gloom. They're not wrong. But here's the thing. This is where balance must be plotted and understood. Much like how, simplify things a little bit, much like how you're planning a big road trip, but you know that you have an older car, and it's probably a good idea to get your car looked at before you take it on that trip. You can take necessary precautions. It'd be wise to take those precautions to minimize the potential fallout for something going wrong. But at the end of the day, if you don't take that risk, take that trip, you may miss out on something truly magnificent. This is the mentality I hope many of you keep in mind as I tell you this story. Some of you may have heard of it. Some of you might get a little confused as new information has come forward. Do not fret. You have to realize when it comes to these journeys, much like the example of the road trip, we have to sometimes take little detours because we didn't realize that part of our planned routes had road construction, and sometimes the construction workers aren't the brightest bunch and tend to fuck things up. At least if they're anything like the ones near me. So whether or not you choose to believe my story is no longer my concern. I know I've fired off before, but this matter is personal to me. It's very dear to heart. And while I understand skepticism is wise in these endeavors, we must also acknowledge that sometimes stories are too grand for the person who experienced these events to even be able to pull out a camera to find themselves proof. As simple as that. But that's the nature of our world, isn't it? While there's a lot of darkness, there's also a lot of light. And sometimes you're so enamored, so captivated by what's going on around you that you forget you have anything on you. And you truly embrace the moment. These moments are special. They define who we are. Much like how finding a way to pull yourself from the darkness defines who you are. So please, again, if you are struggling, know that there is better days coming. But you have to stick around. Be willing to tough it out just a little bit longer. I know it's hard, believe me, but it is possible. You gotta tough it out just a little bit longer in order to see those better days. The story I'm going to tell you has undergone a few different names over the years. I even filmed a bit of a documentary to try to document this case in ways I simply didn't know how when it first came to light. To understand something that has affected me deeply and personally. The label of the timeless child? Yeah, it's a bit of a Doctor Who reference, but you'll see soon enough that it's quite fitting. And for those of you eager to try to discount my story, Well, I'm just going to be honest here. From what I've seen about your behavior, you've got problems of your own you should be focusing on. And if this story somehow helps any of you that see this, that hear it, and that's my only intent. And maybe I fulfilled this story's purpose by doing just that. In many of my previous videos, I disclosed that there's been certain events that transpired in my life. Some of you who met me in person even made certain remarks that indicated you feel maybe wise not to hang around me too much because I ain't afraid to put up a fight against true darkness, true evil. And there have been many of my stories that have almost killed, that have killed innocent lives. This one begins when I was 12 years old. There may be a bit of time jumping, but this is when the ordeal came to my attention fully. There was a number of interpersonal matters coming up in my family that honestly made it feel like the very people I was supposed to be able to rely on hated me. There was constant fights. If something went wrong, I tried to tell my side. I was quickly ignored. The ordeals got to be so frequent and troublesome that I ended up going to live with my grandparents for a little bit. They realized that the turmoil was building up, and if something wasn't done and done quickly, it was going to get rather ugly. So my grandma offered me out to go live with her and my grandfather. More often than not, when a kid is already in a certain frame of mind, that the people they're supposed to rely on hated their guts, didn't want them around, hated them just existing, picking apart every little action like they were some criminal. Yeah, they're going to want to leave. There's probably going to be some individuals that say I shouldn't tell this story. But honestly, those people are part of the problem. We try to ignore the stories that bring us discomfort, that make us face the repercussions of our choices. We avoid those. How do we have a chance to grow? And the people involved in this story, bridges have been slowly mended. I know it bothers them that I talk about this type of stuff and even publicized about it in a book, but at the end of the day, sometimes we just need a slap in the face. And I'll admit, being 12 years old, a young boy entering puberty, there's parts where I provoked the situation, made matters worse. Perhaps in many ways, that's where a lot of us who have issues in interpersonal relationships start to develop the habit of pushing people away just as they're starting to grow close. Even while I lived with my grandparents, the situation didn't improve. My grandparents lived in a small town that had a reputation of pushing outsiders to the point they commit some heinous acts. I went to that particular school district before, and many of the kids have tried to provoke me into, managed to provoke me to the point where I started swinging. Then I got into a lot of fights. Then they tried to play the victim just because I won that fight. Naturally, it's getting to be about junior high time, and being that I was an outsider and had absolutely no interest in getting involved in sports, I was useless to that town. I also know that these behaviors haven't changed. I know that there's still a number of people in that small town who push and provoke to the point where people either try to take their own lives or they take out the people closest to them. Anyone from this small town will try to deny it, but it happens all the time. And I know it personally because that's kind of what happens when you have direct lines with emergency services in the area. Anyway, there came a point where I almost became part of that statistic. I tried to take my own life. And it's possible that I managed to succeed. I won't go too much into the detail of how I put it together, but something intervened. As I was starting to lose consciousness, I remember this bright blue light popping out of nowhere. Then when I woke up, I was seemingly transported into this void of blue light. The way things looked like they were moving around me was like I was deep underwater. The way the light bent and moved. Wasn't able to move my body. I'm barely able to move my eyes. Then, all of a sudden, I start to see this man appear. Look fairly tall, had kind of dirty blonde hair, I guess it would be called. That was about down to his shoulder. It looked like he was wearing some sort of white robe. The visual of this man was very, very blurry. Possible wasn't even a man. The only way I could tell it was a man was when he spoke to me. He starts to walk up to me, stops in what would be about 10, 15 feet away from me, and says, Dakota, there's someone here to see you. I didn't feel any negative intent from this man. I felt like he somehow knew me. He cared about me. He understood what was going through my head, why I was doing what I was doing, but he was not judgmental about it. He steps aside, and all of a sudden, I notice there's a little girl standing behind him. This little girl, she looked like she was about 6 years old. First thing I notice about her is that this little girl, for some reason, looked an awful lot like me. It was pretty obvious that somehow we were related. She starts to, slowly walk up to me like she's nervous about approaching me. Then I notice that she's just absolutely bawling her eyes out, trying to hold it in, but she was hurt. And when I saw this, I felt this pit in my stomach. Like I just knew that this little girl somehow knew what was going on, that this was somebody important. I didn't know how, I didn't know why I felt this way, but one of the first thoughts that came to mind was like, how the hell could I do this to this little girl? I didn't know her. I didn't know who she was. None of that. But I knew that my actions were hurting her. It seemed like this pit in my stomach was enough to kind of jar me more into the vision or whatever you want to call it. Second, I started having these thoughts. There was this little girl. She had a look on her face like, he knows it's me. It's the only way I know it's right. She knew that I somehow recognized her. And the second she had that slightest inclination, she runs up to me and gives me a big hug. I could literally feel her tears on me. I kind of push her back just a little bit to look her in the eye, and first thing I said was, I'm sorry, sweetie, but who are you? She looks at me deep in the eye. And she just had this sapphire shimmer in her eyes. And it started to click a little more that I knew those eyes. I knew I saw them somewhere. She simply just looks at me and says, "Daddy, please don't do it." She gives me a little kiss on the cheek, and I start to notice the blue void around me start to fade a little bit. It was like I was seeing these people observing me. I couldn't really make out a lot of details. Before I had a chance to make out any details, I was sent back to my body. And I was shaken enough to where I was able to pull myself out of that state. I basically, I quickly put everything away that I tried to use to hurt myself. I didn't take any pills or anything like that. So it was easy to kind of just rearrange things to where if somebody were to walk in the next few minutes, I could have just brushed it off as I was looking for something and didn't remember where I put it. I was a 12-year-old boy. It wouldn't have taken much for me to lose something. It was getting late, and that whole ordeal was just so much to process. I just it's like, you know what? I'm just gonna go to bed. I'm gonna sleep on it. Try to figure it out in the morning. I went to school that next day. I I didn't tell anybody what I did. I didn't feel like I could say that. Otherwise, I'd probably end up in locked up somewhere. But I tried to process it. Immediately, the first thing that I couldn't shake was that it's like, wait a minute. She called me daddy. How could I have a daughter? I'm 12 years old. I was 12. It would be another 2 years before I even kissed a girl, let alone had sex. I mean, how the hell could I have a dad be a dad? I was like, okay, no, okay. That had to be some weird hallucination that was just I don't know. I don't know what I was thinking. I was like, there's no way that little girl was real. And there was no way that that was real. No, 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 no. Then there was this voice. Anytime I would try to shoot it down, there was this voice in my head. It was a woman's voice, older, who was getting pissed off at me. And she was like, how fucking dare you? Do you realize what it took in order for her to help you like that? That how could you betray her? That is your daughter. That is your daughter. And honestly, this voice, it freaking overload my head. I was like, all right, all right, all right, all right, all right, all right. How about this then? I was, I honestly started to negotiate. You can see why I've always been hesitant about sharing this stuff because it sounds like I'm having a psychotic episode. If you've been following my stuff for a while now, you know that too much weird shit happens for me to really deny it. That something is happening. I started to barter with this voice. I was like, all right, all right, all right. If that is my daughter, Whose mom? How is this even possible? It was like there's two main questions that came to mind. How was this even possible? And who was mom? Being a heterosexual preteen boy, there was a third question, naturally, that wasn't as important, but felt like I should know. Was the mom hot? Right? I mean, how else? I mean, I don't know. It's a guy thing. I try to behave myself and not be too much of an ass, but I'm still a guy. Anyway, the room this took place in happens to be the same bedroom I turned up in when I had my abduction at the age of 6. Okay. Then there was, but I didn't really try to observe possible as like some sort of alien intervention. I didn't know what to think of it. Sure, I was interested in UFOs, but I'm in Idaho. We have a lot of military bases here. Majority of the UFOs around here were probably military flying around. With recent developments in the disclosure side of things, yes, that was true, but there was more to it. At the time, I only really started researching ghosts, psychic phenomenon, things like that. So while yes, there was still part of me that tried to deny that was my daughter, it's just like that voice. It almost it almost had a certain kind of growl to it. Like a woman trying to beat a guy into sense that that is your child. But again, I was only 12 fucking years old. How the hell do I have a child? I thought first thing that I would think of was, all right, maybe it was like some kind of weird time travel. I was thinking, okay, I don't know. This was just the first thing that came to mind. It's the first thing that made sense. So I started doing a little research when I could. And the only stories I could find that somewhat fit the parameters was a child showing themselves to one of their parents when that something like that would happen. The only instances I was able to come across in my research, granted, I had no clue what I was doing. I was just kind of shooting in the dark here. But the only instances I came across where something similar to what happened to me took place with already expecting parents. They may have not necessarily known that they were expecting a child at the time of the incident, but they would find out later that yes, they had a child on the way. Okay, makes sense, which leaves an obvious question coming from anyone who's had this happen to him, not just a child. More so because I was a child, but again, that backs up the question. How the hell do I have a child at that age? If so, and if this was a case where that the mother was already pregnant, somebody's got some fucking explaining to do. Simple as that. There's a lot of people when I go to tell that part of the story, it's like, oh, you're special. She can't. I was like, I was a 12-year-old child being told that I was a father. Hello, supporters of me too. It blew my mind because it blew my mind that the some of the women I would tell the story to who heard the story, like, oh my god, that's amazing. You must have a special bond. We're also avid Me Too supporters. Like, I was 12. I didn't have sex yet. How the hell do I have a daughter? Ugh. Nature of the beast, I suppose. So I figured, okay, if maybe if the child was somehow able to come to me at that time, maybe it doesn't always have to be pregnancy. Maybe I already know who mom is. Maybe we've met, but we haven't, we're not in a relationship. We met, we know who each other, we know each other somehow. After, if I remember correctly, it was about a week. I get this message on Facebook from a girl that was in a class in my class at my old school, and which seemed out of the blue. We didn't really talk, but to be completely honest, this was one of those girls that everybody had a crush on back then, and I would learn later in life, apparently she had a thing for me too. Didn't realize it. Nothing ever happened. And last I checked, she was married with 3 daughters now. So that ship sailed. Anyway, at the time, she goes to message me, asked me how I'm doing, and said, eventually, good. I'm like, what's up? You and I, we usually don't talk. She goes, well, I wanted to apologize to you. I was honestly confused. I was like, for what? I wanted to apologize for always kind of being mean to you. You didn't really deserve it. You were always so nice, and I just, I just don't feel it right about how I treated you. As I'm saying this out loud, that should have been indicator number one that something was going on, but I didn't, you know. So I kept telling her, I was like, you don't need to apologize. I was never really upset with you or anything like that. I was genuinely confused about why she was messaging me in the first place. But then I realized that clearly she kept persisting, asking if I would forgive her. And I'm just sitting there like, okay, this is new. This was honestly the first time as a man that someone actually reached out to apologize on their own accord. It didn't require any confrontation. It didn't require adult intervention, being that we were still kids. None of that. This was the first time. And speaking as a man, we don't honestly get that all a lot. We're just expected to take all the blows because we're men. I realize, people don't realize warriors need support too. And blew my mind. I was like, okay, wow. This obvious, this clearly means something to her. So messaged her back and saying, I I'll be honest. Like I said, I never really had any problems with you. I never really saw you in that light. There was a lot worse things going on. There was a lot worse happening to where you didn't, but I forgive you and I thank you. And we continue talking. She asked me, where I've been, where I disappeared to. We get to talking enough to where I start thinking about asking to move back in with my mom. So that way I could be back in this girl's class. Which eventually happened, but nothing more happened between this girl and I. And maybe, and as I'm saying this out loud, I have to admit, I kind of got into thinking that putting my situation, my mindset into like some sort of supernatural romantic movie type of story. This was how my head was processing it. Maybe this girl who was writing to me was the little girl who saved my life's biological mother. And this was how we got together. But nothing ever happened between me and her. Which, probably for the best. If it was meant to be, it would be. Growing up from that, anytime I would get involved in a relationship, part of me was always picking apart my then girlfriend, whoever it was at the time, trying to see, like, okay, did they kind of look like her? I was picking apart with, would they be a good mom? But this, blah, blah, blah. Basically, a long line of paranoid ass thoughts that no kid should even have to think of, you know? And that little girl, it wasn't a one-off situation she would appear. There would be times where if my mind started to slip into that ways, it seemed like she would appear again. She would just, kind of pop up in the corner, wave hi, let me know that basically she would do what she could to let me know she was still there. And even then, I was getting paranoid. It's like, okay, she's hanging around that particular girl a lot. Is that her mother? Is that her mother? Is that her mother? People are like, Dakota, how come you have issues with relationships? Is this why? There would be other instances where she would appear in a more intervention-esque manner. Her second major appearance was December 3rd, 2012. I remember that date quite vividly because that was the date that I lost my grandfather, the man who was practically he was my father figure. In the scope that, as the saying goes, any man could be a father, but it takes someone truly special to be a dad. Well, he was my dad. The day he passed away, it was the weekend, and it was pretty common that my mom, my aunt, my sister, my cousins, we would all get together. We would drive out to grandma's, go visit grandma and grandpa on the weekends. It was typical, and they have about half an acre of land, big backyard we could play with, and maybe we would do little barbecues. It was, jump on a trampoline that they used to have back in the day. Maybe do camping in the summertime. That particular day, we all decided to carpool using my aunt's van because, well, the weather was shit. And as we were driving out, I was listening carefully to the conversation because apparently my grandfather had a bit of an incident and it seemed like we were losing him. He had colorectal cancer that spread throughout his body, got into his thyroids. He was only given about 5 years, which ended up being the case. There was one of the tumors that popped up right on his spine. And it grew to a point where you could physically see it on him, sticking out. And we would learn later on that this incident that took place the day he died, it was just a situation where he just went to the bathroom, fell, and couldn't get back up. He couldn't move his legs. It was speculated by some hospital doctors that the hospital here he went to for his chemotherapy, they went to focus the radiation around the tumor on his spine, not directly on it, and it ate away his spine. And that's what caused it, his fall that day, and why we started to lose him. When we started to realize the situation was getting bad, we had to start calling in medics because we knew he didn't have long. We basically, being that I was the oldest kid, I was in charge of, keeping an eye on all the younger kids, and we all we corralled all of my grandma's dogs and all of his kids into one room while the medics came in. Help keep them all out of the way. The room my grandfather died in was my old bedroom. The room where, again, I appeared after my abduction at the age of 6, where I ended up 30 miles away from home. in the same room I first found out about my daughter after I attempted to take my own life. Throughout the day, some of the kids tried to sneak out, particularly the youngest at the time. She didn't understand what was going on, but I had to be stern with her. Said, "Don't leave this room. I know you don't understand what's happening, but it's not good. You got to stay in here." We could hear the medics. I tried to focus in on the situation, try to listen for little clues about what was going on. I was the only one really old enough to be able to understand and process everything that was being said and done. Apparently, my grandfather, he started seeing people. You hear those stories about people in their last moments say they see angels, or they see some of the last people to show up before the last people they knew in life to have passed away to show up. And basically to help him cross over. We started to He started to talk like that, and I was listening carefully, and I wanted so bad to be in that room with my grandfather that some of my psychic side started to kick in. Part of me was able to astral travel. But because it was also such an emotional distress, my daughter, she appeared asking to help, if she could help, keep kind of watch things, see what was going on. This was the day I first learned that my daughter and I, at least, I can do it with other people who kind of open themselves up to me on an emotional level, but I could use my daughter as kind of like a psychic camera. I could see things through her eyes. She could appear in that room and I would be able to see everything. Well, something that caught both me and her by surprise was that my grandfather saw her too. He went to point directly at her and say, "You need to get that little girl out of here." We didn't expect that to happen. We didn't know that was possible. It spooked my daughter just a little bit to where the connection broke. She started to apologize, and I was like, "It's okay, honey. I didn't expect that either. It's okay. Thank you." She stayed in the room with me to try to comfort me. I was the only one who could really tell she was there. The dogs kind of acted like they could see her, but they didn't react too much. They were more concerned because they knew something was off outside that room. Eventually, my daughter gained up a little bit more courage as the medics started coming in, as not as the medics came in, but as emotions started getting a bit higher. And we could all hear my grandma screaming in the other room because my grandfather was gone. For a brief moment, I was in that room with him, walking through the light. And I remember seeing these mountains, just absolutely beautiful. All sorts of birds flying around and all sorts of colors. I could see my grandfather standing with another man. And I called out and was like, "Hey, Grandpa." He looked back, it's like, "Dakota, what are you doing here?" And the man, he just kind of waved, realizing what happened. He's like, "Get out of here. Go." With a wave of his hand, I was sent back. And between all this, my chest just started hurting. I could feel the disconnect. I could feel my grandfather in his final moments as his body was letting go. And the other kids started to realize, "Dakota, what's wrong? What's wrong?" I just looked at him. It's like, "Grandpa's gone." A few minutes later, my aunt walks in the room and tells us officially. Yeah, it was hard. Being that I was the oldest, my grandfather, I had the most time with him. He practically raised me like I was his youngest son. I was only 15, just about to turn 16 when he died. And, that's kind of a point in life where a young man needs his daddy, needs his father. Shortly after he passed, that's when my little ghost hunting ventures started to really take off. I started getting asked to be interviewed for podcasts, books, TV show offers. And I would learn through a lot of my ghost hunting methods that my grandfather still poked his head around from time to time, which was something he promised he'd do back in the day. Hell, shortly after he was first diagnosed with cancer, he made a little joke that if ended up dying, he was going to somehow figure out how to possess one of the ugliest lunch ladies he could find and make her start kissing me. That never happened, but naturally, I just said, "Bring it on, old man." That was the kind of relationship we had. The next major incident with my daughter, I was about 18 years old, just barely out of high school, and we were starting to move house. I had a new car that my grandma sold me, a 2002 Chrysler 300. I ended up getting fired from the call center job I was working at, but we were moving house, trying to start anew, all that. And as we were, doing the last few runs, to clean up the old place before moving out and bring all the stuff to the new one. For some reason, the Chrysler had an issue where you go to hit, it had some sort of transmission issue. I don't know. Now, I'm not a car guy. If I know how to fix something in a car, that means I've already broke it at one point. And whatever was the issue, the car would start bucking like someone was slamming on the gas and the brakes at the same time, and it would just kick like that. I was coming through this intersection, started doing that. I was just like screaming, "No, no, no, no." I was supposed to be alone in that car. I had no one with me. But all of a sudden, in my passenger seat, that little girl was sitting there. For a moment, I could see her kind of just off in her own little world, just hanging out with daddy. Next thing I know, she's screaming, "Daddy, look out." There's a pickup truck who was speeding through the intersection at about 60 miles an hour, hits me on my side. And I was knocked out pretty hard. I just took a pickup to the head. I just took a pickup truck going 60 miles an hour to the head. Yeah. I should have died in that accident. In fact, part of the frame of the car got bent in so bad that I don't, it started digging into my foot, into my leg, just above my foot. Any faster, I probably would have lost the foot. Obviously, I survived that crash, but just after impact, I remember once again seeing that blue light from when I was 12 and the silhouette of my grandfather saying, "Well, you done it now, didn't you?" He's always kind of a sarcastic ass. That particular visit wasn't long until I was back. I was conscious and somehow in the passenger seat. It wasn't a situation where I was ejected, but I was knocked unconscious and eventually was able to wiggle myself through the car and get out on the passenger side. I went to the hospital via ambulance. Told them that, you know, I just saw my dead grandfather. Might be a good idea to get me checked out. They did MRI. Everything looked good. From those incidents, I thought that my child's manifestations could only happen to blood relatives who are in some sort of high emotional stress, some sort of physical trauma taking place. And for many years, that theory stuck. It didn't help try to figure out who her mom was, but it did help me piece together, help me understand what was happening, and that somehow there was some bigger purpose I needed to fulfill. Throughout all these incidents, I would try to do anything I could to make contact with that little girl. There was even a point where I decided to give her a name because it just felt wrong to keep calling her the little girl, the little girl. I went with the first one that came to mind. Said, decided to call her Olivia. Olivia. I asked her if she liked that name. She said yes. She approved it. So one of the names I would call this whole ordeal was the Olivia Paradox. And throughout all that, once again, the theory that it was some sort of psychic time travel taking place held. At least until 2020 came around. And a situation unfolded so severe that not only did my daughter's true history come to light, but so did her mother, so did her brother, and so did mine. And Man, it was brutal. But had she not intervened yet again, not only would I have probably ended up dead, but so would have several others. But then, as I'm writing my new book, I've started to realize that perhaps my daughter did. My daughter didn't first show up when I was 12. Maybe, just maybe, she showed up in my life a hell of a lot sooner.